so much. Okay, so we'll get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our January chapter meeting. I'm Faith Cummings. I'm one of the chapter co-chairs along with Paul. We're so happy to have you tonight. I know it's a little bit late to say Happy New Year, but I'll say it anyway. Happy New Year to everyone because we haven't seen you in a little bit. And we have a really exciting meeting tonight with some really, really great speakers and then a panel. It's all going to be about youth activism and climate education. So we're really happy to have you and to hear from everyone tonight. To start, the way we always gather is under the Jemez principles for democratic organizing. So if you haven't heard those, or if you have, just want to give you a little reminder because they're really important just to kind of ground us before we get started. So the first Jemez principle is to be inclusive, which we really try to do and make sure that we have all different kinds of people from all different walks of life whenever we have any meeting. The second is an emphasis on bottom-up organizing. So we don't believe in a traditional structure where things are top-down. We really believe that everyone has a voice and we want to make sure that everyone is heard. The third is let people speak for themselves. So let people speak for themselves. Yes, number three. So you'll hear a lot of different people speaking for themselves tonight. We definitely, as a climate reality chapter and the leadership team, are not going to be having the entire floor. We always want everyone to share their thoughts. So that's really important for us. Number four is to work together in solidarity and mutuality. That's one of the big themes tonight that you'll hear. So we really believe in that. Building just relationships among ourselves is number five. And then number six is commitment to self-transformation. And there's no better time to do that than at the start of a new year in January. So thank you all for kind of listening to those principles. And I'm going to pass it to Deepa, who has an exciting announcement for you all. So listen up.
Thank you, Faith. So hi, everyone. My name is Deepa Prasad, and I'm the co-chair with Paul Kiesler of the chapter's Our Climate Moment Committee. So what our committee does, what our members do, is we work on lobbying elected officials to urge them to pass legislation with robust climate solutions. And in 2021, we met with members of Congress to persuade them to pass the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better Act. So while we are still putting pressure on the Senate to pass Build Back Better, we're shifting our focus a little bit to New York State and New York City legislation. And in doing so, we want to have the maximum impact. So we took a look at the sources of emissions in New York City. So I'm just going to quickly share a slide. Let's see. Okay. All right, here we go. Yeah, so I'm just sharing the slide to show that according to the 2020 greenhouse gas emissions inventory for New York City, stationary energy is the largest source of emissions in New York City. And that is composed of mostly buildings. There's a few other things that are lumped in there, but that's mostly from buildings. So that accounts for a whopping 70% of New York City's greenhouse gas emissions. So to address this problem, we have gotten involved in an exciting new campaign to reduce building emissions. But I want to make sure we give enough time for our wonderful presenters. So I will talk more about this campaign and about how you can get involved at the end of the meeting. So please stay tuned afterwards and enjoy the meeting. And I will hand it back over to Faith.
Thanks so much, Deepa. That sounds really exciting. I will definitely be sticking around. So what we want to get into next is our wonderful speakers. So we have 4 different speakers tonight. I'll introduce them all separately, give you a little bit with their bio. They'll speak. We'll move on to the next person. And then after everyone has shared, we'll have a panel discussion. So first up is Emma Buretta. Emma's a 15-year-old climate activist with Fridays for Future NYC, which hopefully many of you have heard of. It's great. She's a high school sophomore in Brooklyn, New York, and she began her activism at age 12 and helped lead the 2021 global climate strike in New York City. She's inspired by Greta Thunberg and her Korean grandmother, who's a longtime community activist. So, Emma, I am going to pass it to you first. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. I'm so honored to be speaking with you all today. As Faith mentioned, my name is Emma, and I'm a 15-year-old climate activist with the Fridays for Future New York City, which is the New York City chapter of the movement, which was started by Greta Thunberg in 2018. And with that, we mostly focus on organizing schools for strikes and marches. I'm also an intern at Columbia Teachers College with Youth at the Center, where we're working on a storytelling project where we collect stories of youth in the New York City area who are either involved in the climate movement or have just been impacted by the climate crisis. And we're creating a digital map of New York City with their stories and resources to help youth get involved in the climate movement. And for that, we're using a variety of mediums like voice recordings, pictures, and written work to make the stories as accessible as possible. So through my internship, I've learned a lot about the power of storytelling. And storytelling can help with climate anxiety, both for the person telling the story and the listeners. And it can also inspire people to take action. So I'm going to start off today by telling you all my story of how I got started in the climate movement. So I first got involved with Fridays for Future when I was in 7th grade. I was 12. You can see me here. I just protested every Friday after school with one of my friends. And oftentimes I'd be really scared before the strikes. It would just be the two of us chanting for a couple of hours. But I continued to stay involved. And from there, I started organizing my school for larger school strikes that would happen once every few months. You can see me here. This was in 8th grade for the September 20th strike, which hopefully a lot of you were at. That was huge with 350,000 people there. And I started getting everyone from my school to go to these larger strikes. And then from there, once the pandemic hit, a lot of youth dropped out of the climate movement and stopped organizing. And then a whole generation, well, a short generation, like of high schoolers, they sort of graduated. So a lot of new people had to step in. So I saw that as my opportunity to become more involved with the climate movement. And I also found it a lot easier to speak because with having meetings on Zoom, I wasn't really as intimidated because oftentimes since I was 12 at the beginning, I found it really difficult to talk in meetings because I felt like everyone knew a lot more than me. So it made it a lot easier once we switched to Zoom. So that's how I got involved and sort of grew in the climate movement. Okay, so my work with Fridays for Future in New York City and my internship have also both taught me about the importance of intergenerational climate justice. And I'm speaking here today partially because I really hope that this can start a conversation around generations working together to combat the climate crisis. Without generations working together and leaning on each other for support, the movement becomes really inefficient, where youth like myself have to keep learning everything anew. And adults can't learn from youth either. So in order for the movement to function as smoothly as possible, I think it's really important that generations work together. Also, besides like sharing experience based on knowledge, having youth centered in the movement can bring focus to other MAPA. MAPA are the most affected people and areas in the climate crisis. And these tend to be women, youth, BIPOC, and those living in the global South. And centering these people and highlighting how already marginalized groups are further impacted by the climate crisis brings an intersectional lens to climate justice, which connects it with other movements and social issues. So I think this is also a really important role that youth play in the climate movement. They make the movement more accessible to newcomers and connect it with other social issues. So how can adults create youth inclusive organizing spaces? Well, they can create inclusive spaces not by just using youth as figureheads, which often happens. People will have a youth speaker at an event, or they'll have like one youth on a committee or something, but by actually incorporating them on every level of organizing. That's how you can create a youth inclusive space. So I've been involved with many actions, some of which were more inclusive than others. And one example of a really youth inclusive rally that happened recently was a rally in November, which was led by New York Renews, which is pictured here. So as you can see, they gave youth megaphones on the day of, so they were using them as figureheads in that way, but they also incorporated them into other aspects of their organizing. They had a youth committee, and the organizing meetings for the march were youth led. The adults also supported where youth couldn't do everything. I think this is really important to remember. As youth, we have a lot going on, and there can be a huge mental toll from organizing. So adults really have to be there to support us, because we're really busy with school, extracurriculars, our social lives. And for a lot of us, it feels like we have an extra full-time job of being an activist. So it's really important that while adults are organizing with youth, they make sure that they step up and support youth. And they also step back when need be to let youth perspectives be heard. So another thing that I think is really important is that when adults are organizing with youth, they explain fully a lot of things that maybe people with fewer years of experience wouldn't understand. I think a lot of youth like myself are timid when they're first starting in the movement because they feel like they don't know as much as everyone else. But if everyone kept explaining things every step of the way, then it would make it a lot easier for all of us. So what do youth have to offer? Well, classically, adults perceive youth as only adding a sense of urgency to the climate movement, but we actually add a lot of other things as well. We have innovative ideas and new perspectives on old issues. And without these, the climate movement wouldn't be able to continue to adapt to our ever-changing crisis and maintain its efficiency. And one of the other important things that youth add to the climate movement is that we make it more inclusive, which I mentioned before, and open to the public. And I think we really add a humanity to the movement because oftentimes when people think about the climate crisis, they think about polar bears or coral reefs, and they don't think about how it affects them. But by saying this is going to hurt your children the most, that's what really impacts people and drives them to action. So we both show people that the climate crisis will impact them and that every person can come in with specialized skills and continue to use them to contribute to the movement. So this is a picture from our strike on September 24th of this year. This is me with a bunch of my friends from Fridays for Future New York City. But I just wanted to talk for a bit about what it's like to be a youth activist and to explain the sort of support that we need. So I thought I would just walk you through like my day today just to sort of explain. So like I got up at 7:30, a normal time. I got ready for school and was in class by 8:30. Then I had classes from like 8:30 to 5 o'clock. And then I came here. And between classes, I had to answer emails for Fridays for Future New York City and Slack messages. Hopefully you all know what Slack is. And then from after this meeting, I'll go to another meeting from 7 to 8 o'clock for Fridays for Future New York City. And from there, I'll have a meeting from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock for my internship. And then after that, I'll do my homework for like 4 or 5 hours and I'll go to bed at 1 or 2. Which, I mean, I feel like some of you are probably used to a similar schedule, and I think that's fine for an adult, but it's not the healthiest schedule for a kid. Like I've almost fallen asleep in a bunch of my classes lately just because I don't get enough sleep. And don't get me wrong, I'm deeply grateful for this speaking opportunity and the ability to do this work. And I've met some of the funniest, smartest, kindest people I know because of this work. But sometimes it's just too much for youth. And I don't feel like I'm engaging with this through choice. To me, it's an obligation, because if I don't do this, I don't think I can ever look someone younger than me in the eyes, or look myself in the eyes, knowing that I'm letting my future slip away. And I think that everyone here on this call probably feels the same way. So I'm asking all of you right now to please step up and step back, support youth activists, and get them to share the space, to share their perspectives, just as you're doing today. Thank you. And this is contact info in case you want to get in contact with Fridays for Future New York City. With that, I will stop the share.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was amazing, and definitely a call to action for all of us. So we appreciate it. Next up is Lucy Troy. So Lucy Troy is a high school senior from New York City and will be attending Cornell next fall. Congratulations. That's a big accomplishment. Lucy is her high school's environmental club leader, a co-leader of the Bronx Youth Climate Summit, and the Global Affairs co-director at Youth Climate Inc. So in addition to her environmental endeavors, she demonstrates a passion for social justice by tutoring at-risk foster youth, working on local political campaigns, and volunteering at a nonprofit called Friendship Circle. As a youth climate activist, Lucy is passionate about climate communications and instituting global change by amplifying the voices and experience of those traditionally neglected by people in power, which is very we need that more than ever right now. So I'd love to pass it to Lucy and hear from her for a few minutes. Thank you, Lucy, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, everyone. And thank you, Emma, for that very inspiring speech. Once again, my name is Lucy. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a high school senior from New York City. I think of myself as a youth climate advocate as well as communicator, both through my speaking and writing. I would think that my climate journey began as a freshman when I got involved in my school's environmental club. I was very immediately drawn to the club's collaborative aspect and goal-oriented structure. And I was seeing how members really dared to dream greatly, both in the context of our school and our surrounding Bronx community. After attending an inspiring youth climate conference at Columbia University, which I don't know if any other students or teachers on this call have ever been to, a rising club leader named Emma Vennard had the idea to start a Bronx Youth Climate Summit for students in our district, basically educating on Bronx climate issues and bringing in workshop speakers from all sorts of organizations in our area. So in the fall of 2019, when I was a sophomore, we began planning for the summit by calling schools and emailing local climate organizations, but our plans quickly derailed in March when the world essentially shut down and school went virtual. So at this point, there was a core group of about 5 of us who had been heavily involved in the planning, and we were faced with a difficult decision, which was whether or not to go virtual. And we ended up executing the first ever virtual youth climate summit. And that model has been replicated over the past couple of years as virtual summits have remained the prominent form of climate summit communications. And the virtual format also opened us to an even larger audience. So we were able to welcome students and teachers from all around the world. And we also had to adapt the messaging and the programming, but we're really pleased to see the widespread impact it had. And this is how I initially got involved in sort of virtual climate action. And it was just all overall an incredibly inspiring experience because I got to see the fruits of my labor in a very tangible way, even though it was all through a screen. So the next year, which was last year, I got involved with Youth Climate Action Team, which is a youth-led 501c4 climate nonprofit that grants students around the country service hours for working on our various teams. We have collaborated with the EPA, Gen Z for Change. We put on various speaker events, conduct lobbying events. But my job as Global Affairs Director is actually to establish regional branches across the world. So the biggest part of my job is actually meeting with youth climate leaders and organizers from all different countries. I'd say it does actually impact my schedule a lot, as Emma was speaking about. Tomorrow morning, I'll be getting up at 5 in the morning to speak to a Ugandan activist. Some nights I'm staying up until 1 in the morning so that I can speak to someone from Korea. But I wouldn't sacrifice any of this because my job is truly amazing. I get to meet all these incredible people and hear their climate stories, which is incredibly empowering. And my mission is mainly just to be able to empower their work through the platform that we have as a larger organization already. We currently have branches established in Canada, Germany, Uganda, South Korea, India, Jordan, Mexico. I might be forgetting one, but it is really, really rewarding work. So my main focus right now, as I am wrapping up my time in high school, is actually towards a senior project that I've been approved for. And this project is completely centering climate anxiety. So I'm conducting a study that's loosely based off of the science, using the process of the scientific method to investigate how students at my school are particularly impacted by climate anxiety and whether it actually hinders them from participating in climate action. And this is something that I've dealt with very closely as, you know, an environmental club leader and youth activist at my school. I can see that some youth are really not interested in getting too involved, and it sort of just becomes, you know, just like too much of a common statement, like, why don't you get involved? Why don't you come to the march? Why don't you do this? So after doing a little bit of research, it turns out about 83% of Gen Z Americans are concerned about the health of the planet and say that the quality of their environment affects their health and well-being, which is a pretty stark metric. And I think one of the most important ways to mitigate this sort of anxiety that we as youth are feeling is through climate education, which I know is a topic that's going to be touched on later tonight. Particularly at my school, I actually helped create the climate science curriculum that we have established in all 3 of our major science departments. But there's something that is really missing, is bridging the gap between those older educators, because our teachers were normally separated by a generation or 2, and those younger students. It is very mentally taxing to be sitting in a classroom hearing from a teacher who is much older than you and will not be bearing the brunt of the climate crisis, you know, telling you about everything that's wrong with the climate and everything that we're doing wrong as a country, and never really teaching you about the tangible solutions or even educating you on the possible career paths that will become more prevalent in the climate sphere. So this is something I'm really going to work on as I make some conclusions about climate anxiety at my school. So revising my school's curriculum. I'm also going to be putting together a short documentary with testimonials. I'm not sure if I'm going to be making this publicly available, but this is, you know, certainly work that I'm doing, I guess, just more closely tied to my own community. In addition to this, I'm helping plan finally the first in-person Bronx Youth Climate Summit. This will be for students only in my district, which actually coincides more closely with our original mission, is, you know, really focusing on Bronx students and empowering them to take local climate action. So I'm incredibly excited for that. But again, thank you for this opportunity, and I'm excited to hear from everyone else who's speaking.
Thank you so much, Lucy. That was great. And that project sounds incredible. Hopefully we get to hear how it turns out, because I think we would love to know about that. Thank you. Next up is Justin Pearson. So Justin is the 26-year-old co-founder of Memphis Community Against the Pipeline. He was a leader in the successful community pushback against the Byhalia pipeline, which was a 49-mile oil conduit through historically Black Memphis neighborhoods and a prime example of environmental racism. So Justin, thank you so much for being here, and I will pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Faith, for your kind introduction. Thank you so much to this entire esteemed group of folks who are here today, and to this chapter of people who during our struggle in particular in Memphis were immensely helpful and supportive, including Tim Guinea, who you all know very well. And I see Anshul here and a lot of you who are on our Facebook and who have remained engaged over the time. I have some prepared remarks, but I am going to do what the son of a black preacher would and ignore them temporarily and still try and stick to time, Paul and Deepa. So don't worry. But I want to take a moment to reflect and give us time to reflect on what Emma and Lucy have just shared. And I'm going to try not to get emotional while doing it, but at 12, I was not going to protest. At 15, I was not a leader of a movement. As a high school student, I was not learning about how to fight climate injustice across the globe. And that's for a myriad of reasons. This is extraordinary, Lucy and Emma. And I don't know if I'm supposed to be on this panel, in this group, looking at what y'all done. It is extraordinary, and to the things that have been said in the chat, it is inspiring for folks who are in the movement for justice. It's also motivating. And this is also really sad. This is sad. And I don't know who the apology is supposed to come from to all of us who are spending our life energy trying to save the place we call home, but particularly for folks who've been on this planet the least amount of time to feel the weight and responsibility of doing everything that you possibly can with the life energy that you have to make this place habitable for yourselves and future generations. I am sorry, because it isn't fair. And it is remarkable. And I'm not taking away from the amazing things that you've done and are doing. I'm going to talk about it tonight at dinner with my folks. But this isn't good that you have to do this. This isn't good that you have to even feel the weight of doing this. Like, this is really sad. And for decades, we have been let down. And there are always creative dissenters who, as King would call it, who have committed themselves to the cause of justice. And it has oftentimes been young people who've sacrificed and lost time, and some folks even their lives, trying to make the world a little bit better. But I'm really sorry that you're having to be up at 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. and scream from the top of your lungs, save the place that we call home, because there's no planet B, right? Like, that's really not what you should be doing. And I pray to God that our efforts, I pray that our efforts do create an existence where 12-year-olds get to be 12, and whatever that's supposed to mean, and 18-year-olds and 17-year-olds get to be 17 and 18, and whatever that's supposed to mean, and not feel the same weights and pressures that you do now. And that one day organizations like Memphis Community Against the Pipeline or Pollution may not need to exist. That's prophecy in the church, but it is possibility too. And so thank you for your service to all of us and to our shared home. And I am deeply aggrieved by it too, because the systems that are perpetuating this problem and that have caused it were here before we were born. We are up against institutions and systematic injustices that are very much taking our ability to live away. And firsthand, I unfortunately have had the opportunity to fight these multi-billion-dollar corporations and see alongside our community what has happened and what is still happening. The truth is, climate justice and environmental justice are deeply intertwined with racial justice and economic justice. It is because poor folks and Black folks and Indigenous folks and people of color have been excluded and relegated and excluded for centuries that the climate crisis and environmental crisis is where it is. What do I mean, you say? If we had paid attention to where communities were being being turned into industrial zones 40 and 50 years ago, we would have seen something. We would have seen a pattern of those being most excluded, being the places where these polluters chose. And if people of privilege and people of means and people of a different socioeconomic class had paid attention then and said that is unjust and that is unfair and that is wrong, we may not be dealing with the climate crisis and the environmental justice crisis in the way that we currently are. But by allowing people who have been disempowered to then be responsible for their own salvation, we have allowed a system of exploitative capitalism and a system of perpetual injustice to reign. And now we are relying on younger people and we are relying on other folks to solve a problem that our society has created. We are in trouble and we don't have an infinite amount of time. And I know I don't have an infinite amount of time to talk today, so I'm going to move along here. I will tell you just a couple of things about us, and then I'll tell you about the fights we're in, because it's important that we realize the struggle that we are in is not about the idea, but it is about the individuals, right? This climate crisis, this environmental injustice crisis is about people. And I fear that there are some organizations, not Climate Reality, but there are some organizations that we have to confront who take the larger, broader, more complex idea, and they forget that there are people who are suffering, right? These are folks in our movement, and you'll see one guy I think you know named Al Gore who joined our fight here in Memphis. But these are people who are living in communities that have 4 times the cancer risk of other places, right? These are folks whose water is being threatened, right? This is a people problem that we have in our society. This is not just an idea that we have a problem with that has existed. Memphis Community Against Pollution started in the struggle. In Memphis, Tennessee, the environmental justice movement was launched after the sanitation workers strike, which would be the strike that Dr. King is Dr. King's final act before he's assassinated in Memphis. And that movement continues and is birthed. And our work is to think about how we create more healthy, safe, and just communities, particularly for those who've been most excluded. This is the truth. Across this country, you can see it. The cancer risk in certain communities is higher than in other ones, and it is oftentimes associated to race and it is associated to class. These, again, are not accidental, they are not coincidental, but if we choose social locations, that's what the work is. And that's what I love about this chapter in particular, is a chosen social location with people who are most marginalized actually improves the life of everybody. We have to go to the places that have been pushed to the periphery. We have to go to the places that have been most excluded. We have to go to the places where the income isn't the highest and say, here is where we will elevate their voices. This is real. Go to ProPublica. ProPublica did a report recently and showed the consequences of toxic air. And in Memphis, we have certain communities where the cancer risk is 21 times the national average today people are dying. The climate crisis, the environmental injustice crisis is not something that is coming. It is something that is here. But until we see the folks who are wearing do-rags just as much of value as people who can wear three-piece suits, we're going to continue to see our society perpetuating the injustices that separate and divide us. But that isn't the way that it has to be. We had a huge meeting organized by our state leaders. We had to organize rallies and marches and protests. And again, this is time that was taken away from people spending with their families. This is time that was taken away from people writing books or doing other things in order to save and protect their community, because two multi-billion-dollar corporations decided that their crude oil pipeline was more important than the people in the community. You guys know the quotes, profits over people is the way that our society has been operating for too long. But there is something more powerful. It's called people power. And in movement building, it is going to require us to take the voices and the people who've been most disempowered and continue to empower them. It's going to take us organizing and galvanizing across race and across difference to build what the McGee calls the solidarity dividend in order for us to win. We won't be able to do this in a separated and segregated fashion. And actually, I'm convinced that the environmental justice crisis and the climate crisis might be the biggest galvanizing tool across race and across different demographics than any other thing. And we can see that success is possible. And so I want to thank you again for helping us to defeat the Byhalia connection pipeline, but we didn't stop there. We used that momentum and we passed laws to protect communities. And now we are part of an environmental justice movement that will continue to be propelled forward. And look, the fight is not over. One fight, it only revealed the problem that many of us have experienced for a long time. Both of my grandmothers, God rest their soul, died from cancer in Southwest Memphis. This stuff is personal. And now they have toxic coal ash that they're moving in the community, hundreds of trucks per day. And they didn't tell anyone in the community because, again, the lives are seen as expendable. There has to be a change in the way that we view people and the change in the way that we talk about our communities that have been most oppressed. And there has to be a change in the way that we fight. So you can join our fight here. You can continue to support MCAP. Go to our website, follow us on all the social media, support in all of these different ways. But I think it is important that we do the hard work of just telling the truth. And the truth is that we are in a difficult place. And we didn't choose per se to be in it. But we're here now. And we're together now. And I, despite all the heartache, believe that we will still win, because in this fight, we are right. And I don't care what senators vote and all these other people say, we're right in this fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justin. That was very, very powerful and so important for us to absorb and think about. But, I also think it's really important to have our next speaker, because the work she's trying to do is, basically get climate education into schools to be able to teach young people, but to also make sure that older people are paying attention and that they're taught as well, because as you know, children become adults. So her work is really, really critical. So I'd love to introduce Emily Fano. Emily is an urban sustainability education leader with 2 decades of experience in the nonprofit sector. For the past decade, in her role as senior education manager for the National Wildlife Federation in New York, Emily has designed and managed a variety of urban environmental conservation, outdoor learning, and climate resiliency programs for K-12 youth. So I'm going to pass it to Emily. Emily, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Faith, for that introduction. And I want to give huge props to Justin and Emma and Lucy for their incredible work, incredible words, and really hard to follow that. And I really it moved my heart, and I really appreciate you and all the work that you're doing. It's incredibly important, and very grateful to the youth for their, I call it sacrifice because it is a sacrifice, and you know, everybody's standing on your shoulders. Yeah, I'm going to start sharing my screen and my presentation. I will probably need to refer to some notes, but bear with me, please. All right, can everybody see that? Okay, perfect. All right, so I'm here to talk to you all about climate education and the status of climate education in the United States, and also in New York City and New York State. So obviously the question to ask ourselves, of course, is what's the problem we're facing? And I think we all know, all of us who are gathered here know that the latest IPCC report, you know, issued a code red for humanity, and we know that you know, the climate crisis is impacting every part of the world, every sector of society, and we have a window of under 1 decade to, you know, prevent further catastrophe. So that's what we're facing. We all know that here. We also know that young people are facing climate anxiety. There was a landmark study out of Bath, England, that showed that students are feeling, young people between the ages of, I think, 16 and 25, are just feeling that governments and adults have basically failed them, and that they are very afraid of their future because of the climate crisis, and they feel sad, afraid, anxious, and angry. We also, of course, know that thankfully there's many organized environmental groups and youth groups that advocate, including Fridays for Future and others that march for climate action in the streets, often thankfully tens and hundreds of thousands of people, both here and across the world, but more often than not, the crowds are not demanding climate education. This is a huge oversight, in my opinion, the opinion of my colleagues, because climate education is really the missing link in the climate action agenda. As the United Nations acknowledges, education really is the key to addressing climate change. We know that education can encourage people to change their attitudes and behavior. It helps people make informed decisions, and of course, young people can learn about the impact of global warming and how to adapt. And knowing the facts eliminates anxiety, because knowledge is the antidote to action. So unfortunately, UN data from UNESCO from 100 countries shows that only half of the world's national education curriculum make any reference to climate change. And in the US, only 36 states in the District of DC include the reality of human-caused climate change in their regulations, in their curricula. And so, we know that from a 2016 study, that 71% of middle and high school science teachers only spend about 1 to 1.5 hours per school year teaching climate. And some of these classes are only taken by 7% of high schoolers, because those are covered in earth science classes that are only taken by 7% of students. So, fewer than half of teachers say that they even address the issue in the classroom. But the good news is that this past November, for the first time at the COP26 in Glasgow, climate education actually came to the forefront. And there was actually a meeting in November of 2021 where ministers of education and environment came together to pledge to integrate climate change and sustainability into curricula. This was organized by the government of Italy, UNESCO, youth partners, and so on. So governments after this meeting sent pledges that they would increase climate education in their countries. And students are also beginning to rise up to demand that schools give them the tools they need for their future. They see climate impacts happening around them. They want to understand the causes and solutions. Often students are getting their news outside of the classroom, and schools are not rising to the challenge at the scale that's needed yet. We know that teachers also have told us that they want to teach about climate in the classroom. 86% of teachers in a poll in 2019 said that they believe climate change should be taught in schools, and a majority of parents with kids under 18 also believe that, and as early as elementary school, and that was irrespective of political affiliation. We actually put out a survey with the United Federation of Teachers, which is the local teachers union, back in June of 2021, to find out what teachers were thinking about climate change and whether they were, teaching about it or not. And 52% said they did teach about it, but it mirrored the national number of about 1 to 2 hours per year, and that was really inadequate. 73% of teachers said they believe that climate change will harm future generations. A majority did not have training in it, and said that they would want to. And basically a majority just said they lacked the time to teach about it. They not only lacked the time, they lacked training, and they lacked curriculum to teach about it. But the heartening thing was that out of over 1,000 teachers that answered this particular question, 59% were asked whether they would support a mandate to require students to learn about climate change, and 59% of those teachers said yes. The other thing to note is that the American Federation of Teachers, which is an affiliate of the AFL-CIO, so a labor union with 1.7 million members and representing 80,000 early childhood educators and paraprofessionals and even government employees, passed a resolution in August 2020 in support of the Green New Deal. And as part of that resolution, they basically expressed their support for climate education. They said that they would work with community groups and environmental groups and so on to not only advance education, but also infrastructure investments in our schools. And this really is out of a realization that students are missing out on education that will prepare them for the emerging sectors that they're going to need in the future. Almost half of young people feel that they don't have the right skills, according to the World Economic Forum, for the emerging green jobs of the future. And 4 in 10 workers will need to be, completely retrained to take advantage of these jobs. There's positive, news that several states have taken the initiative to move us in the right direction. New Jersey is the first state in the nation to announce a climate change mandate, climate education mandate in 2020. Washington State's Climb Time program allocates several $million from the governor's budget for a K-12 climate science literacy grant program. And California just recently approved $6 million for all students across the state to learn about environmental and climate justice and climate education. So, but we really feel that in New York State, we have 2.6 million K-12 students across the state, and they really also deserve equitable access to globally relevant climate education that prepares them to thrive in a climate changed world and equip them with the knowledge and skills that they need to for these high skilled jobs and the emerging green sectors. And we don't want New York State to be left behind. And we also know that an educated citizenry is going to be needed to help New York meet its ambitious goals in the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, also known as the Climate Act of 2019. And as our students become adults, they will become voters and users of energy, and they will have to make decisions in support of these big goals. And so it's in the state's interest, in the state education board's interest, to make sure that we have a climate literate citizenry. The other thing that happened in 2016 was that the New York City Council passed a climate education resolution rather, it's 0375-2014, after 2 years of pushing by youth activists from Global Kids. And this led to the New York State adopting the Next Generation Science Standards in 2017. And these standards introduce climate change to middle school students, and they, essentially help link human activity to climate change, and et cetera. However, in our survey, we found that only 35% of teachers actually use those standards. Most of them use the city's scope and sequence, which is this K-12 curriculum that the city Department of Education uses. So in 2020, the New York City Department of Education Office of Sustainability, with whom we partner, formed this climate education leadership team. And that was formed to address the gaps, the climate education gaps in New York City schools. And a team of about 30 teachers meets monthly to find entry points for climate education in the scope and sequence across grades and content areas. And they also provide professional development for teachers. So that's a really positive thing. We also have a couple of really good blueprints for K-12 climate education that were published recently. My colleague, Christina Kwok, wrote this excellent published document called A New Green Learning Agenda with Olivia Casey, and it outlines the kinds of skills and subjects that students should be learning about in school. Skills for green jobs and emerging sectors, as well as skills that foster the ability to be open-minded, to cope with uncertainty, to think critically, to work collaboratively, and then see big picture things to think in terms of systems and value Indigenous and traditional knowledge. These are all things that that our students, of course, that kids should be learning about in school. They're not really getting that kind of education right now, but they could be. And this is a blueprint that shows, that really lays it out. Another excellent document is the Aspen Institute's K-12 Climate Action Plan that's very comprehensive and acknowledges and prioritizes the opportunity for the education sector to really step up and advance climate solutions at the scales needed. And so it really envisions schools as models for climate action and climate solutions, so that we can create sustainable, resilient, and equitable societies. So now I'm going to kind of just give an overview quickly of the Climate Resilience Education Task Force. So I essentially, this is a body that I helped to found in 2018 out of the realization that we, my colleagues and I, saw a need for an apolitical body that could really increase access to climate education in New York City and across the state. And we actually co-managed the task force with We Act for Environmental Justice, because we are committed to racial, social, economic, and environmental justice. And we do also prioritize youth and frontline communities in our work. So starting in 2020, we actually launched a youth steering committee, and we to uplift youth voices and make sure that students are engaged in advocating for the climate education that they want in their schools and communities. And so we mentor high school youth in learning about and taking action on climate education policy. And this year we have a cohort of 14 amazing high school students from across the city, and also a couple from New Jersey. So we worked with our students, actually, there were 3 climate education bills introduced in New York State the last legislative session. We worked with our students to help analyze the bills and provide feedback to the legislators about their bills. Our youth last year did some amazing work, created a toolkit of resources, facilitated meetings with elected officials, created this Earth Week of Action in support of the legislation, launched a petition, and they're doing amazing work. This year, we have been invited by Senator Rachel May whose bills we have decided to support because the other legislators decided not to advance their climate education bills this legislative session. And we were invited to provide edits to both the sponsor memos and the bills themselves. And we had a lot to say about the bills. We felt that they could be greatly improved. And so we, working with our youth members, submitted those comments to Rachel May's office, and we're waiting for them to get back to us. We will also be creating memos of support so that the bills can move out of the Education Committee and go to the floor for a vote this session. And we'll also be helping to find assembly co-sponsors. The other thing we're doing, I'm almost finished, is that we are looking at the Climate Action Council draft scoping plan that the state put out that's aligned to the Climate Act. And we are looking for any mention of climate education in this scoping plan, and we'll be submitting comments to the state in support of robust climate education as part of the plan. So we would love to see people, join us. We're having a meeting on February 17th at 4 o'clock for our task force. I'll put the link in the chat when I'm finished. And we welcome anybody who's interested in joining the task force as members. We invite you to please support the climate education bills that we're also supporting, and to work with us to submit comments for the Climate Act draft scoping plan. And I think that's it. So thank you so much for inviting me here. I hope I didn't go too long, but there's a lot to say. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was amazing, and definitely, I think, makes us all very hopeful for the future. I know that we are coming up to time, but we do have some questions. Emma, I think you may have to leave, so let me know. We do have a question for you if you can answer it quickly, but if not, totally understand. But yeah, would love to ask you some questions that have been sent through. Emma, will you be able to stay for a question, or do you need to leave to your next meeting?
I can answer a question quickly. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'll ask you one and then we will let you go. But Emma, I wanted to ask you, everything that you were talking about, of course, seems very all-consuming with you doing your climate work and, being in high school. So the question is, how were you able to get your parents on board with your climate work? What were their reservations, and how did you help them overcome them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So at first, I would say they were pretty resistant. Like, I was like, oh, I'm going to strike school every Friday. And they said, absolutely not. You can never skip school for like climate things. They said maybe like once a month you can do it. But other than that, they said you have to strike after school. And then as I got sort of more and more involved, they started to accept it more, because I think they realized that this is becoming like a huge aspect of my life. They're still pretty resistant now. Like, when I have a lot of calls, my mom, she's always like, you have to cut up your calls. You have like too many. And she always wants me to prioritize like socializing and seeing my friends instead of doing climate work. But I would say what really made them on board was I got my sister involved. So it used to just be me. But now I have an older sister who's 18, and we do a lot of our climate work together. We can cover calls for each other. We'll do speaking opportunities together. And it just makes it a whole family affair, I think. And it makes my parents feel really invested in it, because they feel like, oh, both of our daughters really care about this. We should care about it too. So that's how I've gotten my parents on board.
Awesome. Thank you so much for answering that. And we don't want to keep you from your next meeting, so we cannot thank you enough for being here. And we'll definitely be following everything you do. Hopefully we'll be alongside you all striking sometime soon. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Our next strike is March 25th. We just released the date today, so I hope to see you all there.
Awesome. We will be there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Next up, we have a question for Lucy. Thank you, Regina, for sending this. So Do you have any idea what your major at Cornell is going to be? And do you have any thoughts on your plans for the future?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I'm currently going to be majoring in communications with a concentration in science, risk. I think it's like health, science, and environment. But I could also see myself going down the environmental studies route instead if I don't choose to pursue environmental studies minor. I think right now, though, my biggest focus has been on the avenue of climate communication, along with, my speaking engagements. I'm also the science editor for my school's newspaper, and I found a real love and passion for educating the general public on new climate work, new climate developments. So I think that that's something I'd really like to continue in college. And overall, just and I'm also particularly interested, I think, in agriculture tech, ag tech, or agriculture technology, which is why I'm going to be in the agriculture school at Cornell. So yeah, I hope to do a lot of great writing and communicating on sustainable farming.
That's amazing. Thank you. Yes, we need lots of help with communication in everything around climate and climate science. So we know you will give us a lot of help on that. The next question we have is for Justin. So, Justin, do you see a future where the fossil fuel corporations are ever not receiving billions of dollars annually in subsidies? And how will this be possible when so many of our politicians receive money from these companies?
Yeah, it's a great question. I am, here's my book on my desk by Naomi Klein. This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. Not sure how many folks have had the opportunity to sort of read this book. It's like 450 pages, so buckle in. And I think the premise of this argument is also the premise of this question. Our economic system is directly at odds with the science necessary to protect the planet. A system that is rooted in how can you extract more, right? With profit motives, like as the guiding principle, cannot be the same system that does the hard work of real transformation in the way that we operate and function as a society, saying stop, right? So no more extraction, no more of those types of cars, no more of those types of bad, right? Like this status quo will not work. And what I say to my friend is the status quo that gives billions of dollars in subsidies and money to multimillionaires, which is half the folks in Congress, right, is doomed to ensure our failure to save our planet and our existence on it. And the truth is, right, and this is another key point in the book, right, the planet sustains us. We do not sustain the planet. And there has to be a paradigm shift in social, cultural, economic values, and a new realization that we rely on the planet for our existence. It does not rely on us for its existence. And this, the way that we have idolized people who have a lot of wealth, and the way we've idolized corporations and literally, made corporations into people in order that we might idolize them. This status quo will ensure our failure to create a planet that is habitable in perpetuity. And so what then do we do? We have to continue to be subversive to the status quo. And I mean that in a very real way, that there is no tinkering with the machinery of the way things are operating. There's no tinkering with Congress people who are saying we can do cap and trade. There's no tinkering allowed at this point with a system that intentionally produces injustice, right? Like we tried that. We've tried tinkering, and it's gotten us to where we are, where we have the effects of climate change. It's only going to get worse. And at this point, we have to say to people who are in positions of power, to people who we are proximate to, that these things are unacceptable. And our power, right, is in our voice and it is in our vote. And we have to defend those two things as best as we can, including increasing the pot of people, which is why Lucy's work is important, to explain what's going on with climate change and environmental injustice in a way that reaches people, so that it isn't some high level idea, but it's directly impacting you today. This is your water, this is your food supply, this is our life together. So that then that translates into more people power for elected leaders who need not be there. And so, and I would not solely rely, and I know I'm over time on my question, but I would not even solely rely on the institutions, right, to be the centers of change. Because what we saw in Memphis was that first, the movement was being built. We had people from all over the country joining, and that, in addition to going into court, and in addition to fighting for some legislation, but really galvanizing people outside of the institutions, right, is what was where the power was. And that scared people who were in power to do something. And so it's not going into the institutions to then empower us to fix it, but instead there's power outside of it that scares the people who are within it. Because only thing a politician really wants is to get reelected, right? And so it's like, how do you leverage people power toward just causes, to interplay with that, what's in their mind? Because corporations, they can spend a whole lot of money, but they don't get any votes.
Thank you so much, Justin. That was great. And our last question will be for Emily. And thank you for Regina for sending this one. So, as we've all been seeing on the news, there's a lot of pushback, within current school boards when it comes to curriculum. So, Emily, do you see that, in trying to introduce, different topics around climate, environmental justice, that this might be another flashpoint in a lot of, kind of culture wars and conversations we're seeing today? Or do you think that, people will be receptive to, changing education in this fashion?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of resistance, especially in more conservative states, and certainly our state in New York. New York is not all liberal. There's definitely bastions of, conservatism upstate, smaller rural areas. We're not, all the same in our beliefs, but we are working in a fairly progressive district here in the largest school district in the country, and what happens here has repercussions across the state and across other states, and even across the world, because what we do here matters. And so we're lucky that we have, over, I would say, more than half of teachers already teaching about climate change, and many passionate teachers who are pushing it and doing it on their own, and students increasingly demanding it. And I don't know if you all recall, but de Blasio a couple of years ago actually, had to kind of agree to allow students to go out and strike. I think they had to have their parents' permission or whatever, but there was so much interest in the strikes that he had to agree to let people go out of their classrooms. And we had entire schools that were doing climate teach-ins before the strike and then going out en masse to the strike. So I think our time has come, like it's now or never. And we have to, as Justin was saying, create the people power, the pressure from students, from teachers, from parents, who all want climate education in our schools, to build the pressure, to these more conservative education boards, that we demand this, and we're not going to stand back and let you decide that, we should just teach to the test and, learn about climate for an hour a year. That's just not acceptable anymore. And we have the United Nations saying that all countries should make it a priority. We have some champions in government like Ed Markey, who introduced the Climate Change Education Act year after year after year. I think it's been 7 years that he's been trying to pass that act. So, we had Barbara Lee, Congresswoman Lee from California, who 2 years ago introduced a resolution for climate change education mandate in the country. It didn't pass, but she stood there with other elected officials and students, making that her voice heard. So I think it's building slowly. I think people are really starting to get behind this, and it's become an issue that is becoming part of the mainstream conversation. So I think we can only go up from here, and we can't back down and grow a people-powered movement.
Yes, I hope the same. So thank you so much, Emily. I want to thank Emma and Lucy and Justin and Emily tonight. This was such an amazing and moving and inspiring meeting. I encourage you all to stay afterward because we're going to hear and learn about some really great things from Deepa. So please stay after. But thank you so much to our speakers and panelists and everyone who attended tonight. We really appreciate it. So thank you.